And we want to check whether, well, I guess we need to take attendance.
Yes. So welcome everyone to the February meeting of the Colorado Board of Land Commissioners. And it's one of those times where it was very convenient for all of us to meet virtually. So welcome to the polar vortex or whatever we're having again. Let's do a roll call of commissioners. Commissioner Chavez,
Here.
Commissioner Scanlon,
Here.
Commissioner Heath.
Here.
And I'm here, and we understand Commissioner Clark will not be joining us, but we do have a quorum.
Thanks,
Okay.
Commissioner Frobe. On our agenda, the first item we've got is our usual placeholder for executive session. Staff does not have any items to present during exec, but we just want to double check that all the commissioners, in case any of the commissioners have something they would like to see or discuss, if we maybe need to go into exec. And seeing nothing, we'll start the public meeting. I'm going to click the button and start inviting attendees and the public to join us. So if you'll hold for me for a second. And we are live.
Great.
Commissioner, you want to take it away?
Yes, so welcome everyone to the February meeting of the State Board of Land Commissioners. And this is the time in the agenda where we welcome comments for non-agenda items. So anyone listening, if you would raise your hand, we'll promote you to, what is it, presenter, I guess. Panelist.
So on my end, things are moving really slowly. So I'm just going to give it a couple of seconds for folks to filter in. Just to repeat that, if you're listening along online, if you had a comment you wished to make to the board concerning an item that is not part of today's published agenda, raise your hand and we'll bring you to a panelist status and you can make your comment to the board. And we'll hold for a few seconds, checking for any hands. Lightly attended and no hands, Commissioner.
Great. All right, and I think over to you again, Nick, for announcements.
I love hearing myself talk. So I actually don't have any particular announcements. I think there's some stuff that if you'll indulge me at the end of the meeting, maybe we'll go over what staff has in mind for our touring season this year. Make sure that we're all lined up on the next couple of meetings in terms of logistics anyway. And if I saw Tim Brass pop in, so maybe in the staff report section, I'll just highlight a few things from the staff report, but that's it for now.
Okay. Well, Mr. Brass, ready to share?
I'm ready. Good morning, commissioners, interim director Massey. A couple updates from DNR. First, just want to start with a couple of staffing updates. As I think you all are aware, the State Land Board Director position has been posted and applications are being collected and are going to be due on March 24th. As the staff report in your packet mentions, Chair Frobe and Wendy Padilla are currently working through this process together. Next update, wanted to share an exciting effort that DNR has been involved with regards to a new designation of a Sentinel landscape. This is an effort that's been led by the state and a collection of NGO partners, which include the Nature Conservancy, Trust for Public Lands, Palmer Land Conservancy, El Pomar, and a number of other community organizations, as well as the Department of Defense. And these groups are working together to establish a new Sentinel landscape designation around the Colorado Springs area. This effort builds on the security, open space, and agricultural resilience effort, which seeks to identify properties where potential incompatible land uses could interrupt critical military airspace. The State Land Board's recent Bohart Ranch deal is one good example of how this effort can help ensure for military readiness while also conserving critical wildlife habitat and agricultural land use. The Sentinel landscape was first established back in 2013 through a partnership that aligns the objectives of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Department of Defense, Department of Interior, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, all to better strengthen military readiness, conserve natural resources, bolster agricultural and forestry economies, increase public access to outdoor recreation, and enhance landscape resilience. In coordination with state, federal, nonprofit partners, we plan to submit a formal application this spring for a new Sentinel landscape designation around the greater Colorado Springs area. And we'll be sure to keep you all updated as this process progresses. That we expect some of the Department of Defense's priority state land board parcels that were identified through SOAR to be an integral part of this effort moving forward. A couple of legislative and budget updates. Just a quick reminder, as I know we've covered DNR's legislative priorities already, but we plan to run bills which include the following. Strengthen wildlife trafficking prevention. We'll be working on a bill that was recently introduced to provide free state park access for enrolled members of the Southern Ute and Ute Mountain Ute tribes. Working on a bill to facilitate reclamation of abandoned mine waste piles, creating a new water supply forecasting and mapping program within CWCB, improving and strengthening regulation over at ECMC, implementing process improvements for the Division of Water Resources. And then in addition to those bills, we'll be working on the funding legislation that we run every year for water projects, as well as the Species Conservation Trust Fund projects. Moving on to a couple of federal updates. This week, DNR's Executive Director, Dan Gibbs, is in Washington, D.C. to help share the state's priorities for moving bipartisan natural resource management and conservation solutions forward in the coming years. As part of this trip, Dan was invited to present to the House Committee on Natural Resources Federal Lands Subcommittee just yesterday. And during his testimony, Dan highlighted the importance of balancing our growing recreation economy with the robust mineral and energy development that already occurs on public lands in Colorado. Dan also highlighted bipartisan opportunities to advance shared stewardship of our federal lands through management agreements like the shared stewardship agreement that the state currently has in place with the U.S. Forest Service, as well as through place-based agreements for popular recreation destinations like Arkansas River Headwaters and Pikes Peak. Dan is also meeting with the Colorado delegation to share the state's interest in moving bipartisan wildlife conservation recreation policy forward in the coming years. Through these meetings, the passage of the Explorer Act has been applauded, and Dan's also been making sure the state's commitment to move other outstanding bipartisan natural resource management solutions forward, which include the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, the Wildlife Corridors Act, and the Public Lands and Public Hands Act. We are closely watching other changes occurring at the federal level, especially regarding the new executive orders from the Trump administration. Moving on to a couple of energy updates. On January 27th, ECMC hosted a public hearing on the Crestone State La Plata South Oil and Gas Development Plan. The department appreciates the land board staff making the time on Monday evening to attend that hearing. And this proposal is the first OGDP to be considered under the Lorry cap that was approved by ECMC last year. The commission heard public comment at the hearing and is also accepting written public comments. The OGDP is scheduled for a commission hearing on March 19th, and the commission is committed to holding public comment hearings for each of the OGDPs submitted under the Lorry cap. ECMC will also begin the annual high priority habitat map update rulemaking on February 26th. As you remember, ECMC updates the HPH maps for purposes of oil and gas regulation on an annual basis based on recommendations from Colorado Parks and Wildlife. The annual map updates include statewide updates for certain species with a particular focus this year down in the southwest part of the state. The deadline to file written comment on those is February 21st. ECMC's produced water rulemaking hearing is scheduled to begin on February 27th. The rulemaking will set targets to increase the use of recycled produced water and decrease the use of fresh water in oil and gas operations. The deadline to submit written public comment is February 13th. Finally, the Colorado Energy Office and DNR have been hosting a series of listening sessions for stakeholders and the public as part of the study of renewable energy siting, which was directed by Senate Bill 24212. The next steps in the process are that CEO and DNR are going to start drafting the report, and we plan to have a draft ready for public comment in May. The final report will be due to the General Assembly in September. Lastly, a couple updates from CPW. This last week, Colorado Parks and Wildlife provided testimony in support of a bill which will prohibit the release of personal information for livestock owners who file game damage claims. This bill is designed to help prevent some of the violent threats which some livestock owners have faced from wolf advocates. Additionally, this past Monday, Governor Polis joined Colorado Parks and Wildlife and local community members from the greater Colorado Springs area for a media event announcing a new partnership to advance recreation resources on and around Pikes Peak. DPW hopes the shared management approach will help advance unmet recreation interests in the area, which range from improved trail management to new water-based recreation opportunities. And that concludes my report. Happy to answer any questions you may have or bring items back to the DNR team.
Well, commissioners, anything? Yes, Josie?
Yes. Tim, can you say more about that Sentinel process when you said it would affect the land around Colorado Springs? What do you mean affect? What, in zoning or in what way?
Yeah, good question. So the idea is to really provide some coordination between funding that is available and state and local and federal agencies that are focused on natural resource management. And so the program has been in place for quite some time. I think ultimately it helps sort of streamline specific projects through some of that coordinated funding and coordinated planning. And so we're in the very beginning process of planning for the designation, outlining some of the priorities for the Department of Defense, some of the federal agencies, the state, local community members, trying to bring all of that together. And I think down the road it could help sort of further projects like the Bohart Ranch one that I referenced. I don't think that we have seen specific zoning changes come out of other Sentinel landscapes, but I'm not familiar with the specifics of what's played out at all of them. But for the most part, I think it's more focused on the kind of a project-based approach. So.
Thank you.
And Commissioner Heath, I'll throw in there that my understanding of some of what the Sentinel Landscapes effort is just coordination on a larger basis with different federal, local, for-profit, nonprofit parties. We have our effort going around that we've been working on already for the REPI properties that are of interest to the DoD. And this is supportive of and
Okay,
encompasses that effort.
thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
Yeah, thank you.
All
Commissioner
right.
Scanlon's got her hand up.
Yeah, just
Oh.
I don't know if this probably isn't a Tim question as much as a Deb question, but given that the director's position will be posted through March 24th, have you all figured out process for how you're going to sort through those resumes from there, or is that still to come?
That is underway, and if you're all right, I'd love to boot that to the end of this meeting
Sure.
because we'll be talking about some of the implications for the commissioners on meeting dates, etc.
You got it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for asking. All righty, then let's pass it back to Nick and see if you want to highlight some things from your staff report.
You bet. Thanks, commissioners. Lots of good updates and info in the staff report this month. The agency just continues to plug away at the busy work that we have ahead of us. But I think what you see in the staff report this month kind of falls into the buckets of staffing and public interface. We have had a lot of new positions to work on, as well as some turnover and some exciting promotions that have happened. We've detailed those in the last couple of staff reports, and the work continues. And everything is moving along nicely. We get a nice response to the posts we get out there for the different vacancies we've got. As you probably saw in the staff report this month, William Golston has announced that he will be retiring from us, and I think hopefully for him, from all the hard work that he's put in his whole career, at the end of April. So we've got transition plans in place. We've got a posting in the works. We're getting staff feedback on what pieces of that job are working well and things we might want to update. And so we're excited for getting that posted and soliciting applications on that. So yeah, and to the degree that the commissioners want updates on what's going on with the director position, Commissioner Frobe is at the center of that with DNR leadership. And so, always ask when you want updates, and we'll make sure we talk about it every chance we get. So from my standpoint and from staff standpoint, we are hands off. DNR has its plan for how it wants to proceed as a department on the vacancy, and we'll always get questions answered when you have them. So ask away. That's really all I had.
Great. Well, thank you, Nick. And let me add my congratulations and also gratitude, William. I remember when you were first hired, and kind of in conjunction with the whole movement towards regenerative agriculture and the Lowry asset management plan. And I remember feeling at the time how delighted I was that the State Land Board had managed to attract you to take on that field ops position at that time. So, gosh, it's been a while. Thank you for your service, and we'll miss you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner and Commissioners. It's been an absolute pleasure, one that I've enjoyed very much, and I'm going to miss this bunch for sure. But looking forward to a couple more months and have a lot of work to do before I'm ready to go away completely. But thank you.
It's a great job.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll wait to say real goodbyes till
Yeah.
later.
Yeah, for
Good.
sure. Yeah. And hopefully we'll maybe, Nick, as you all coordinate your going away or retirements, there may be opportunities for the commissioners if they're in town to join or to say
There-
goodbye in a more
there
fulsome
will-
way.
There will 100% be opportunities for that. If this group likes anything, it's raising a toast to the people we appreciate the most. So
Okay.
stay tuned.
Great, great. Thank you. All right, and it looks to me from the agenda that we do not have any requests for review. Is that correct? Can you confirm that?
That is correct, Commissioner.
Great. So moving on to final action, and we get to hear again from Mindy on land life.
Thank you. Good morning, Commissioners. I'm Mindy Godsagan. I'm the Conservation Services Manager for the State Land Board, and I'm here today before you as also manager of the Ecosystem Services Program. I'm bringing before you an action item. Let me share my screen. Okay. All right. I hope I do this right.
You will.
Okay. Shoot. Sorry about this. Are you able to see my screen now?
Yeah, that looks great.
Yes.
Thank you. Well, I'm here before you today as the manager of the Ecosystem Services Program, and it's my pleasure to bring before you an action item for board action on the Land Life Forest Carbon Ecosystem Services Lease 117157. You will remember that 2 months ago, I brought this item to you as an information item to present kind of the background of the Forest Carbon Program, our work to date thus far with Land Life, and kind of a more in-depth view of how this project would work. I'm going to skip some of that today or kind of go over it as a more high level and focus on what we've done in the last 2 months. I also want to say that Clara Rowe from Land Life, the Strategic Partnership Director for Land Life, and Zach Dutra, the Partnership Manager for the Rocky Mountain region, are also online and available to answer questions. They will not be making a presentation today, but are available for any questions. Okay. Okay. This project is about restoration and revenue. In fact, this kind of encapsulates the Ecosystem Services Program, which is how to monetize ecosystem services and generate revenue for our trust beneficiaries. This project will be our first one for within the voluntary carbon market, and it'll be generating revenue for all of these properties are in the school trust. We'll also be covering what's coming in the, I'll be reviewing the lease components that we reviewed at a high level in December. I'll also be focusing on what we've accomplished in the last 2 months and looking at the steps ahead. As remember, there are 5 properties involved with this lease, and these will just be parts of 5 properties. These properties are spread throughout the state. Silver Mountain in the south, I'll start with the south. Silver Mountain is in Huerfano County. There's a large property in Milk Creek in Grand County called the Milk Creek property. And then 3 separate sections in Larimer County, central Larimer County, Young's Gulch, Bluestone, here we were still calling it Bluestone Park, and Eagle Canyon. The combined amount of acreage that we're expecting is going to be about 1,000 acres. This number will change depending on the actual site visits and the final planting plans, but we're expecting the amount of reforested land to total about 1,000 acres. I'm going to go over some of the lease highlights. The first is that there are parts of 5 properties. Only the properties that are only the parts of the properties that are replanted will be part of the lease. The expected revenue for the Ecosystem Services Program and for our trust beneficiaries is about $87,000. This will be paid upfront, and so the value to the land board is higher than if the payments were stretched over time. The lease term is 40 years. This will actually start from the completion of the last tree planted, and this will be taken into account in the final lease, but the general lease term is about 40 years. We're expecting about $1 million of investment from the private sector in state trust lands to create this project. There's an opportunity for future carbon credits in year 41. And this project will contribute toward the state's greenhouse goals, greenhouse gas goals. The Land Lake project phases are basically composed of 3 phases. One of pre-planting, and this is taking place now. Planting, this will just take place, we expect, over a month or 2. And then post-planting. This will last a period of up to 40 years. And so these phases are not actually shown at scale in terms of the time that they'll occupy. Going back at a little bit more detail within year 1, year 0 to 1 is just what we're very much engrossed with right now. Identifying the sites, working out the contract, our final leasing, developing the planting designs, meeting with stakeholders on site, having those designs validated by local experts. That includes our own State Forest Service that we work with to manage our forest resources, and then actually planting execution. All of that's expected to take place this year. In year 2 through 4, excuse me, will occur the validation and registration process, following up on the actual planting that occurred, and having the project registered on the voluntary carbon market. We'll be using the Verra Carbon Registry. And then finally, the last years up through 40 is verification and issuance of credits over time. The monitoring, verification, reporting will occur through the registry as part of the registration project that Land Life will do within that registry. Monitoring will occur approximately every 5 years. And then after year 40, from year 40 to 100, excuse me, that's the process at which, or the time at which the state land board will be able to make the decision then whether to continue the carbon forest, the project. At that point, the carbon rights would return to the landowner, which would be us, and we could decide to continue leasing those or selling those credits. Finally, I want to just kind of show this slide as a general overview of the responsibilities and the 3 major parties involved with this project. The top row shows Land Life and shows their obligations in each of these 3 phases that I just outlined. They'll be doing the heavy lifting with this project. As with many of our lessees, we lease the land and our lessees complete the project. Again, I talked a little bit about what's happening in year 0 through 1. Years 2 through 4, they'll be looking at how many seedlings survived, replanting if necessary, registering the project on the registry, and then doing periodic site visits. And then years 50 through 40, we have that long-term maintenance. The state land board's responsibilities on the second line are really much more modest. We're going to be involving our lessees, working to approve the planting plans, working with our lessees and updating them on the process. But we really have a much more modest role in really just looking out. And I would expect that the ecosystem services manager will be checking in on these properties from time to time. And then finally, the State Forest Service, as our lessee, is really involved in an advisory capacity. They've already been involved. We engaged with them as early as July and had high-level meetings with them. They've been involved one-on-one at the local district level with the Land Life representatives, and that will continue entirely all through planting. And then subsequent to that, they'll be providing logistical support and more advice. They do have an opportunity to be involved with maintenance, site maintenance over the 40-year period. We don't want to, we don't expect those management responsibilities to be very much or maintenance during that time period. Some of the pictures you'll see are actually showing these, or the one that I showed previously really show it takes a long time for these trees to get started. And once growth really begins, we would expect maintenance to really be modest over time. And there is within the lease the opportunity to make modifications based on public safety and also site management within certain parameters. Are there any questions up to this point with some of this information that I've shared? Okay. This next slide shows wildfires that have occurred throughout the state. Those are the areas shown in orange. And then our surface land distribution. And you can see that we don't have that many state trust lands on some of these wildfire areas. And certainly the ones, there have been some on the plains where there are no trees, but for forest carbon opportunities, we're really looking at these larger forests that have occurred in the middle of the state. These are the locations of the 5 projects. And while we're looking at this to be a pilot project and with future opportunities for land life moving forward, we actually don't have a wealth of properties in these areas. And so we're looking ahead to areas that have that could possibly burn in the future. But we're looking forward to kind of learning a lot from this lease and then hopefully with opportunities for future involvement. This is a chart showing the 5 reforestation sites, the 5 properties. And this also shows the total property acres, the amount burned, the reforestation acres, the percent of the burn area on those properties, if there is an affected grazing lease, and the project percentage of the grazing lease. This area that I've highlighted in the 3, those are the 3 that actually have grazing lessees. The remaining 2 properties do not currently have a grazing lessee, but do have recreation lessees. I want to point out that recreational hunting should not be affected by the reforestation project. That's completely compatible, both during the area, the initial first 10 years, as well as up through year 40. We've been focusing on working with the lessees in these top 3 because, as I pointed out in December, when the seedlings are first planted, they benefit most by not having livestock grazing on them for the first 8 to 10 years until they reach a height that they can withstand that pressure. And so I'll be talking a little bit about those 3 properties in particular as I move forward.
Mindy, I do have a quick question just out of interest. On Milk Creek, what were some of the constraints on land forest addressing a higher percentage of the burned area?
Well, we didn't want to take too much of that property at this point. Some of the areas that were burned were coming back successfully. Other areas, there's a high percentage of aspen regeneration, so they wouldn't have qualified for a forest carbon project. Again, if the properties are coming back on their own, they don't meet the conditions that the planting would generate reforestation that wouldn't happen naturally. In all of these cases, it's been over 5 years since the properties were burned, and we can tell that some of in fact, we looked at up to a dozen of other properties or other sites, and some of them did not qualify because regeneration was happening naturally. And I'll show you some of the pictures that you can really see that we're not seeing some of this regeneration.
Great, thank you. That's helpful.
Okay. And then finally, this next slide also shows that one of the properties is in the Stewardship Trust. That's the Silver Mountain property down in Huerfano County. The landowner notification and involvement is a little bit different than that, or the lessee notification, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. The other 4 properties are not in the Stewardship Trust. This slide you've seen before. These 5 maps show you the maps of the properties and both the burn areas, which is shown in the diagonal kind of orange color. Milk Creek is on the left, and you can see that the Silver Creek fire did burn a significant portion of the western part of the property, but the proposed replanting for the Milk Creek property is just this one part of Section 16, just going into Section 9 just a little bit. And I think it's about 200 acres or so. This area to the south has some areas that could qualify, but is largely also a lot of aspen. But we felt for this project, it was best just to focus on the small area on the Mill Creek property. The 4 other properties burned completely from, the wildfire swept through the area completely. What you're looking at with the purple area is that is Land Life's estimate of the potential replant or plantable areas. Obviously, if there's steep slopes or rocks or the soil isn't right or the aspect, those areas would not be included in plantable areas. Again, the 2 on the right, Eagle Canyon and Young's Gulch, both in Larimer County, are not currently grazed at all, and both have recreational uses on them. And I want to point out where we're looking at this map. The areas subject to the lease would include only the areas that are ultimately planted. And so the lease, even though these lease sections are included in the lease, the final lease area or the premises that will be described will only cover the areas that are actually planted. Those areas may differ slightly from what's shown here based on the final planting plan, site visits that will occur in the spring and through the summer, and then that final GPS boundary of where those plantable areas are will be the areas that are subject to the 40-year lease and also subject to the granting of the carbon credit rights for the 40-year period. Are there any questions here before I move on from here?
Mindy, Commissioner Heath's got a hand up.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
Hi, Mindy. Mindy, this may be a question for Land Life, but perhaps is the carbon registry a federal project or is that a voluntary project? How do people get the credits?
I'm going to pass that question to Clara Rowe if she's available. Nick, if you could promote her to speaker. I will say that it's not a federal program. This is outside a regulatory program.
That's right. That's
yeah.
right.
Thank you, Clara.
Thank you for the question, Commissioner. It's a voluntary program. It's actually managed by a nonprofit that's headquartered in the US, but operates in many places around the world where there are carbon projects that are being developed.
Okay. Thank you. Good.
Of course.
And actually, there was one other part of the question, I think, Commissioner, about how the credits work. Did you want to talk about how this is being funded, Clara?
Sure, absolutely. So the credits, the projects themselves are funded through the purchase of carbon credits. And there's a few different ways that can happen depending on the structure of any given project developer. So for Land Life, what we do is we work with a buyer of credits upfront. We help project the carbon accumulation over time. We look at the conditions of the sites where we're going to be planting, the mix of species that we're going to be planting, and we project out what the future carbon accumulation will look like from that project over time. And based on that projection, we're able to work with a buyer to secure financing upfront to make sure that we can pay for the projects, that we can pay you, that we can pay the planting crews, et cetera. And then over time, as the carbon accumulation materializes, the third-party auditors from the certification scheme come, they verify that indeed the trees are growing, that carbon is accumulating, and credits are issued. And those credits go to the buyer who has financed the project upfront.
Thank you.
Of course.
Okay, so moving on, I want to just show you a little bit about those 5 properties again. This one is the Silver Mountain property in Huerfano County. It burned 8 years ago in the 2017 Spring Creek wildfire. It is leased by the Nature Conservancy and JW Cattle Company. So it is leased for grazing. This recreational use is a private use. I want to point out at this property that you're looking at some pretty steep areas that will be involved, excuse me, with the reforestation project. This is Silver Mountain that we're looking at. I would say in the photo about 85% of it is state land board ownership. I also want to point out that because I want to talk a little bit about the impact to grazing lessees on the 3 properties that do involve grazing. And I will talk about how we're accommodating that and addressing that use and working with our lessees on that. These areas are fairly steep for cattle to reach up into, to graze up into. There's no water, there are no water sources near the peaks of these mountains. And this lessee has used vents for the last several years, that those radio collars that track the movement of cattle, and and also kind of direct cattle when they come up against an electronic imaginary fence. We've been able to show that the cattle really aren't moving up into these areas very much. And so that's helping us develop a grazing management strategy for keeping livestock away from the newly planted trees. The next property is our Milk Creek property. This is a photograph of part of the area that will be reforested. A large part of it was just off here to the right too. There's a kind of a plateau or a saddle that will also be part of that reforestation area. This burned 8 years ago in the Silver Creek wildfire, and it's leased by Peak Ranch LLC with David and Karen Hammer. It's also in the CPW hunting and fishing, the public access program. This is our Bluestone property in eastern, or in, I guess, central Larimer County. You can see the plains just off into the distance. This is kind of the first hills that raise off the plains in the foothills. This property burned 13 years ago in 2012, and this photograph was taken just 2 months ago in December. And you can really see how some of these areas are just not coming back and reforesting on their own. This is leased by Robert Graves, and has no recreation lessee. One reason it's not in the hunting and fishing access, it's surrounded largely by private land, also owned by Robert Graves, and there's not very good access. Okay, moving on is the Eagle Canyon property, not far from there, also in Larimer County. This burned in the Cameron Peak wildfire. There has been no grazing on this property for a number of years, but there is a private recreation lease held by Mike Slate. And you can see that while there's forbs coming back, there really are not many trees coming back yet. And then finally, we have our Young's Gulch property in central Larimer County. This property is almost completely surrounded by U.S. Forest Service land. It burned 13 years ago in the High Park fire. There's no grazing lease, but it is leased by CPW as a state wildlife area. And then I want to point out that 4 of these 5 properties are also in our state Forest Service management lease. This one, Young's Gulch, is the only one that isn't. It's largely because access is so difficult. It was very, very hard for the state Forest Service to manage. And so that said, we're still working with them and collaborating with them on the reforestation and the planting plan. So I want to talk a little bit now, take a little bit of a tack and tell you what we've done the last 2 months in terms of notification of these projects, comments received, and working with our lessees. So the first of these, we reached out to our lessees actually before December. We've been working with them for several months, both grazing and recreation lessees. Again, started working with the Colorado State Forest Service back in June and July, and that work has continued on an individual basis within each county with the properties affected. But we did have kind of a very large Zoom meeting back in July with probably 15 to 20 participants. Again, working with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, notifying them and getting their comments back about this proposed project. This is something we do as our normal line of business review as well. Notify Colorado Parks and Wildlife on nearly every new lease that we have except for grazing and recreation. We also reached out to the U.S. Forest Service. And finally, because of that one property that is in the Stewardship Trust, the board may remember that we have a special notification and comment period for any new uses that are proposed on Stewardship Trust properties. In this case, we're required to reach out to the local government. This was the Huerfano County Commissioners. We also need to reach out to the Stewardship Trust nominator. In this case, it was Huerfano County, so they were doubly notified in a way. We also reach out to all current lessees, and then finally, any other appropriate agencies. Our policy actually requires us to notify CPW, but in this case, this other appropriate agencies really addresses who's nearby, what other stakeholders would have an interest or be able to comment on this. And in this case, the Silver Mountain property is not close to Forest Service land, but it is close to BLM land. It has BLM land on one or two sides. So we reached out to BLM for comments as well. What those comments received and what they looked like are, first from our lessees, the major comments really had to do with what would be the impact of removing those planted acres for the first 10 years. How would their AUMs be affected, their animal unit months and the number of cattle allotted, and how would billing be affected because of this reduced grazing, and also managing grazing starting in 2026. I also want to point out that even though our grazing leases allow a 1-year notification for the removal of even a single acre from their grazing lease, all the lessees affected did agree to waive that 12-month notice because they'll still be allotted the full 2025 grazing season. Planting won't occur until after the grazing has, the cattle have generally come down from those high elevations by that time. State Land Board staff also commented on this. There were concerns about, making every effort to minimize the impact to our grazing lessees, to consult with CPW on impacts to wildlife, and I'll be talking a little bit that the next click or two. Also recommended, this is part of our standard line of business review now as well, to consult with History Colorado, the State Historic Preservation Office, on any potential impacts to cultural resources. We don't believe a project like this will have really any impact. We do require a Class 3 cultural resource survey for any area subject to kind of surface disturbance. The planting of new tree seedlings doesn't qualify as a surface disturbance like impact, but building of new roads would. We don't contemplate that at all for this project. And then there'd be no ground disturbance within 100 feet of riparian areas. Again, we don't expect that to happen with this project. And in fact, the land life lease prevents us to plant in wetlands. So we'll be away from any riparian areas as well. And then finally, to wash vehicles prior to entry to prevent the transmission of noxious weeds. Comments from the Colorado State Forest Service and the U.S. Forest Service. Basically, they both support reforestation projects and just encourage us to use native tree species and even consider the species ecotypic, or the seeds that are ecotypic to the areas that will be planted, considering genetics, the tree zones, the seed zones, and the elevation for the planted areas and where those seeds are coming from. And then finally, CPW also provided comments. They did recommend time activities to reduce the impacts on wildlife. And they listed this different species. I've collected them all here in one list for you, but they do vary by property, of course. And so Land Life has agreed to take that into consideration to do whatever they can to minimize those impacts. CPW will also be involved in the stakeholder meetings. I'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide or two. And then CPW also asked us to minimize impacts to fall hunting. That will be the biggest challenge probably of these recommended things from CPW because the planting will occur in the fall. So we'll do what we can to minimize those impacts and really looking at what the planting, the hunting for areas of ours that are open to public access, looking at the open, there are sometimes several weeks that are open given the hunting season, the different weeks and so forth, but Land Life has also agreed to try to minimize those impacts as well and continue to work with CPW. Are there any questions about any of these comments? Okay. And then grazing management. This was really the focus of our work the last 2 months. We did hold one-on-one meetings with the 3 grazing lessees of the properties that have grazing plans. Some of those meetings are still continuing. For example, we have a meeting next week with the Nature Conservancy and JW Cattle, on this the Silver Mountain property. And we're still working, although all 3 grazing lessees have agreed to waive that 1-year notice, working with them on getting those riders necessary from our lease to adjust the grazing lessee, to adjust the animal unit months after that planting area is actually established. We can't do that right now yet because we don't know exactly where those planting areas are, and we don't want to prematurely remove too much or too little from each grazing lessee's lease. Again, grazing will be restricted on planting sites for up to 10 years. That will involve animal unit month reductions, and the fencing solutions that we've come up with are: on one property, we'll be using the temporary electric fencing. That'll be probably the solution for the Mill Creek property. Using vents or electronic collars. The Bluestone property is already, that lessee is establishing, or it's either using vents or Gallagher electronic collars starting this fall, so the cattle will be controlled from that section using that. And then finally on Silver Mountain will be a combination of the fact that the project is going to be occurring on steep terrain and possibly some of these other measures. That will be determined in the meeting that will happen next week. And then finally, again, I mentioned that they've agreed, these 3 grazing lessees have agreed to a waiver of the 12-month notice. For example, if we were to give notice today, that would end in February of 2026. But really, given that all these properties are mountain properties, grazing doesn't usually happen past September anyway. So they've agreed to that, to waive that requirement. And that finally, all of our lessees, both recreation and grazing, will be involved in stakeholder on-site visits. Any questions about any of these parameters or any of these issues that came up? Okay. And then finally, next steps. Again, I've talked about this a few times, our spring site visits and planning with our stakeholders. Land Life will do that as snow gets off these sites. We'll be involved, both the State Land Board lessees and staff, the State Forest Service staff, and CPW, along with any other obvious stakeholders that come forward. Land Life will prepare the site planting plans. Those will be reviewed and approved by both the State Forest Service staff and the State Land Board. Fall planting will probably happen from mid to late September to late October. And then the carbon project will be registered after planting is completed. And then finally, just a final last summary before the staff recommendation is to share with you the major lease terms. That involves a 40-year lease term for those areas that are actually planted. We're looking at approximately 1,000 acres of previously forested sites that are now burned, occurring over 5 properties. The lease revenue that was negotiated by staff is $87 per acre planted, that will all be paid in year 1. This will actually be paid in 2 installments, 50% or about, there's a significant, I forget the exact amount. I think it's half of $87,000 planted, or to be paid upon execution of the lease, at the signing of the lease, but the second half to be determined based on the actual amount planted upon the final planting of the last plant. No grazing or livestock grazing will occur on planted sites for about 10 years. Land life maintenance ends after year 3, and at that point will be taken over by the State Land Board. Carbon rights will revert to the State Land Board in year 41. And finally, the expectation that land will remain forested for 100 years, but no lease obligation occurs after year 40 unless the State Land Board renews the forest carbon project on the Vera registry. Again, remember that there's no permanent easement or even a temporary easement put on the property. The State Land Board was able to demonstrate that our 30-year history of managing forested lands has not been to sell for development. Indeed, over 30 years, we only have 1 sale that wasn't to a public agency, either a county open space program or the federal government. Are there any last questions about any of these lease terms? Okay. And then finally, staff recommendation is that based on information provided to the board at the February 12th, 2025 board meeting, staff recommends the board approve Ecosystem Services production lease ES 117157 with Land Life Company USA, PPC, committing parts of 5 state trust land properties to reforestation and livestock management activities totaling approximately 1,000 acres of wildfire damaged trust lands, as identified in Exhibit B. And that Exhibit B is it's a list of the state trust land properties. And the board delegates authority to staff to finalize the lease language for the forest carbon project and take appropriate actions to ensure the success of the lease.
Thank you, Mindy.
And the
And
next,
I'll just say from my perspective, and I'd like to see if there's any questions from the other commissioners, that the process we have of you doing a deep dive on this, a month or two before, and then bringing it back and highlighting sort of changes in status or what have you, is really useful. So I, for one, don't really have any questions because I feel like I have retained what you told us in the recent past. So
Great.
thank you for that. Other commissioners, have you any questions about this final action?
No questions, but amazing, a lot of work for 1,000 acres. Let's hope the next, if we do this in the future, it should be, it's a lot of work, as Mindy just showed us.
It's a win-win, I think. I'm
Yeah.
excited about it.
I agree.
All right. Well, I think, Nick, shall we see if there are any comments from the public on this item?
That one. If there are any public comments or anybody attending that would like to make a comment, please raise your hand and we'll get you moved over so you're able to speak. Not seeing any hands raised, Commissioner.
Thank you, Alec. All right, then, may I have a motion?
Madam Chair,
Yes.
I move the adoption of the Land Life Forest Carbon Lease ES 117157 as detailed in our board packet, with delegation to the director to take appropriate action.
Thank you, Commissioner Heath. May I have a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Commissioner Scanlon. All right, Commissioner Chavez, how do you vote?
Yes.
Commissioner Scanlon?
Yes.
Commissioner Heath?
Yes.
The chair votes yes. Motion carries 4-0.
thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for your work, Mindy.
Thank
Yes.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Okay.
All right, then, the next final action we have on the agenda will be presented by Abe Medina on the policy repeal. And I would like to thank thank the public for the comment that we received in writing about this agenda item. Very thoughtful and detailed, and we appreciate it. Thank you. And the commissioners all received it. So, Abe, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. For the record, Abe Medina, Recreation Program Manager with the State Land Board and FAA Certified Remote Pilot. I don't have a presentation for you or slide deck for you this morning. I will just be talking about the item. So I'm here this morning to present on the Unmanned Aircraft System Policy 200-007 and request that the board repeal this policy as staff feels it is no longer necessary. As Chair Frobe has mentioned, we did receive public comment regarding this board action. The board has, and that comment has been shared with the commissioners prior to the meeting. The UAS policy, or the Unmanned Aircraft Systems Policy, also known as the Drone Policy, was first enacted by the board in early 2018. At that time, the federal government had just enacted rules and regulations applicable to all recreational, commercial, and government drone users in the U.S. And as a government entity, the State Land Board had two options for how it could operate drones in its land management purposes on state trust land. The first was to operate under Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA, Part 107 regulations, which provide operational standards for all commercial and governmental drone use. Some of these standards include a requirement that you can't fly fly under 400 feet above ground level, maintain visual line of sight while flying, and understand the national airspace system. The second option that we considered was more onerous to qualify under. It required a application to the FAA for a certificate of waiver or authorization, otherwise known as a COA, from the Federal Aviation Administration. If granted, the COA would allow very wide exemptions to Part 107 rules and regulations, allowing the land board to do things such as fly after sunset or over crowds, and also allow us to self-certify our own pilots for operations as long as they were done in accordance with our self-enacted rules and regulations, and all operations were for government purposes. When we first enacted the drone policy, we didn't really know what we needed. We just knew that it was a technology that would help us out with our day-to-day management and inspection of our properties. We did look into the COA process to provide maximum flexibility, and at that time, part of applying for a COA did require the establishment of a policy or regulation for agency drone use. Hence why we brought forth the SLD, Unmanned Aircraft System Policy. Once we started using drones in our operations, we quickly realized that we could very well operate under existing Part 107 rules and regulations, and as a result, we chose not to pursue the COA policy or the COA certificate of authorization from the FAA. Currently, staff does operate its drones under existing Part 107 regulations, including remote pilot certification through the Federal Aviation Administration, registration of all our drones in our fleet with the FAA, and the use of remote identification technology, which allows essentially air traffic controllers to be able to recognize who's flying what drone at what location should there be issues. To avoid duplicity in regulations, and because we operate under existing Part 107 rules and regulations, we don't believe that the UAS policy is necessary. We use drones as a land management tool similar to IGIS technology or ATV use on our properties, and we operate under existing federal and state regulations. Additionally, all our leases contain language indicating the possibility of drone use by staff during property management activities. So for all these reasons, staff does recommend that the board repeal the Unmanned Aircraft System Policy 200-007. And I'm happy to answer any questions or comments regarding this staff recommendation.
Hey,
Mr. Chavez.
does the state of Colorado have any regulations that are more stringent than the federal?
The state itself does not have any statewide policies that apply. The federal government does have a pretty robust process for, especially if you're flying for commercial or governmental use. They have a pretty robust set of rules and regulations. There are, however, jurisdictions or communities, towns, and counties within the state that have additional rules and regulations to drone use. For example, the city of Aurora doesn't allow you to fly in any other launch a drone in any other parks unless you have a permit for drone use from their parks department. Same applies to the city of Denver. So local jurisdictions often do apply those types of more stringent regulations, and we as or myself as a certified drone remote pilot do have to follow any applicable rules at any given level.
Thank you.
For the rest of the commissioners, I could also add that, this is a bit of an outlier policy, if you will, because most of our policies are intended to delegate the scope and particulars around decision-making and actions to be taken from the board to the staff. So this is sort of a more procedural one that's a little different. Are there any other comments or questions from the commissioners? Right, may I have a motion? Oh, how about any other comments from the public?
Yeah. If anybody would like to make a comment that is in attendance this meeting, please raise your hand and we will move you over so you're able to speak. Not seeing any hands, Commissioner Frobe.
Okay, thank you. Back to the request for a motion.
This is Commissioner Chavez. I move we approve the policy repeal of the unmanned aircraft systems 200-007 as described in the board package.
Thank you.
I
Second?
I will second.
Thank you, Commissioner Scanlon. All right, Commissioner Heath, how do you vote?
Yes.
Mr. Chavez?
Yes.
Mr. Scanlon?
Yes.
Chair votes yes. Motion carries 4-0.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Commissioners.
Abe.
Thanks, Abe.
Now we have the one and only Andy Bissett to talk to us about the leasing agenda.
Good morning,
And,
commissioners.
Can I ask you a quick
Andy-
question before you start, Andy?
Absolutely, please.
For the sake of sort of efficiency, I held this request from the staff report to put into this portion of it. And that is, would you, I think the other commissioners might find interesting sort of the logic or the a little more context on the Silver Spur lease lease actions that staff took in the, under your regular authority. So if you could speak a little to that as well as highlight the current leasing agenda.
Sure. You're speaking about the staff leasing report, which is part of the information items packet. And there was a couple of acreage adjustments from regarding Silver Spur leases.
Which
The
is a
district
large
office,
lessee of ours in Jackson County.
yeah. The district office is looking to sort of realign acreage in order to more efficiently sublease in the future. So that's why in the middle of these terms, these acreage adjustments were made. If that makes, provides the context you're looking for.
Yes, I think so. So it's sort of just interesting as large acreage and one landowner. And so there's basically looked like a separate lease was created out of portions of the first two lease that would allow that parcel to act independently of the other holdings. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the understanding from the district office is that was going to align better with the sublease interest that they had on a smaller portion of that large acreage.
Great. Thank you for that.
We do have the board leasing agenda as well for your review. Again, Andy Bissett for the Transactions and Record Services team. So there's only two items this month, both from Lincoln County. We do, and both are competitive bids. One's an agriculture bid and one's a recreation bid. No specific highlights. Happy to answer any questions on these two items the board may have. But yeah, staff does recommend approval of the February 2025 board leasing agenda.
And can you, given the discrepancy between the standard rate and the bid received, the delta between $19 and $50, is there any color or context you can provide to us? I mean, good if it's a trend, but there may be some other considerations here.
Not specifically on this item. I don't know if William has any color on that, but as he's met, he does have his hand raised.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, I just have a bit of input if I could on that. I think the best explanation I think I can make on these is that we see a handful, 4 to 5 of these bids a year, mostly in the north and northeastern part of the state. And this is typical of the situation. It was essentially two neighbors who both had, very good access to a parcel, and the neighbor who didn't have it wanted it evidently very badly. And personally, I don't think this is a trend. I think if it were a trend, I think we would find ourselves in an uneconomical, we would put our lessees in essentially an uneconomical position if this became the norm. But however, we do find these, very large bids that come in, as far as in my opinion, no economic reason, just a desire for more land and land that's easy to access for them, and they choose to add it to their portfolio. And honestly, I think the other thing that it could be a determinant in this is that they're willing to pay this for 10 years with knowledge that after that, if they do not receive a competitive bid, the commissioners will remember the lease would go back to the standard rate, and they would then have 118 right protection going forward. I think that probably comes into play in some of these decisions as well. And just while we're on the subject of rates, Jared and I will be bringing the new grazing rates formula that we're working on with the Grazing Rates Roundtable, and also going to take it through our Ag Roundtable and then bring it to the board, bring a recommendation to the board in the near future. So
Great,
that's
thank you for that
coming.
update.
And that will be our recommendation, I believe, is going to follow a more commodities-based rate base. So, but anyway, I'll leave it at that for now. But does that answer the
Yes.
question? Okay, thank you.
Commissioners, any other questions? Alec, are there any members of the public who need to speak on this?
If anybody would like to make a public comment, please raise your hand. Not seeing any hands, Commissioner.
Alrighty then, we have a motion.
I'll move that the board approve the board leasing agenda for February 2025.
Thank you.
Second.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Heath. Commissioner Chavez, how do you vote?
Yes.
Mr. Heath?
Yes.
Mr. Scanlon?
Yes.
And the chair votes yes. Motion carries 4-0. Thank you, Andy and William. And now we're on to the minutes. Are there any changes, modifications, or comments to the minutes of the last meeting? Hearing none, then the minutes will pass by acclamation. And then I'm moving it over to Nick to share some excitement and interest about the next several months for this board.
Thanks, Commissioner. So just thinking about trying to plan out the next several months for board meetings and board tours. Staff has been really thoughtful about putting together what we think we would like to show you, I suppose, from our holdings across the state. So we've got this sketched out, and hopefully you're seeing my screen well. Somebody give me a thumbs up. So starting with April, what we've laid out is 6 months worth of touring, knowing that we're going to need to commit some time to the director process. We may need to be moving some of these things around or just deferring them to another time. But starting with April, we want to head northward. And I've summarized what we're talking about in April to water and ecosystem services. Coming up in the next few months, staff wants to, we'll need to get board approval to do some things with Glade Reservoir, some leasing opportunities, transactional opportunities happening there. And it puts us in the neighborhood of looking at another reservoir that makes use of state trust lands. And then we've got some of our ecosystem services projects in the neighborhood. So we'd like to get out there and do that. Looking across the 6 months, the reason June is in blue right now is it's just a reminder to me that we would anticipate doing June as an out and back from Denver in one tour day, whereas everything else would be an overnight where we would do a tour on day one, typically our Wednesday that we've set aside, and then we would do our meeting on Thursday in the location generally identified, and then travel home that afternoon.
And Nick,
ahead. Yep.
I may interject now pursuant to Commissioner Scanlon's question and some late breaking updates over the past couple of days. It's highly likely now that the Wednesday of the May board meeting, and what I'm waiting to hear on is whether or not a portion of the Thursday board meeting day will be dedicated to executive director panel interviews. So I'm thinking that, you know, perhaps we can flip it and put the May tour visit, or we can rearrange it how we want, but May is going to be Denver-centered interviews and activity now.
Okay, thank you. So I've got that in my notes, and as a staff, as we're working on building that out, we'll keep that in mind as you find out more concrete information. I think we can say that's somewhat dependent on Director Gibbs' schedule, trying to get him available.
The only thing that's in question now is whether or not he will allocate a portion of the 8th in the morning, should we need it for, you know, if we have a full panel of 6 candidates to interview.
Sounds good. So keeping that in mind, it's possible that we don't even have an opportunity to tour in May. I mean, we ask you as volunteer commissioners to put a lot of work into this board, and we want to make effective use of your time. If we can get out, we'll support it. If we need to do something different, we'll support that as well. So just to kind of transcribe or not sort of explain my notes a little bit further. In May, I'm calling it sort of ranches in the RFP. Sorry, I was trying to find my other notes. There's a timing opportunity to talk about ranch RFP processes, because we need to put an RFP out or get ready to do an RFP on the Chancellor Ranch. It's a good timing for us. Again, if we need to do it differently, we will. And then we have our annual ag lease property sort of in the neighborhood, Bear Creek, that we would love to be able to show you and potentially talk about some water infrastructure out there. But there are some things in the neighborhood. So we would anticipate, depending again on director process, it would be a sort of thing where we would have a pretty full day of touring on day one and then a meeting on day two. And we'll be flexible as needed. Mentioned June being sort of did I have that right in my notes? Am I looking at the right? Oh, I'm looking at I'm looking on the wrong side of notes, sorry. So June, we're thinking probably like an out and back single day. I've characterized it as agriculture, ecosystem services, recreation, and a national landmark visit. We've got, in terms of ag, we've got our Teague Ranch out in near Fort Morgan or in Fort Morgan. And so that's kind of the direction we're headed. We've got an ecosystem services lease that we'd be interested in showing off. There's a designation in process for a National Historic Landmark in Logan County, where the battlefield that is being designated and has some state trust land involved. and feels like a neat stop. And I might have skipped over ecosystem services. We've got some opportunity as we're driving by things to stop in and look at perhaps Box Elder Creek, wetland mitigation bank, and lots of leasing along that route. So that's the plan. July, I've characterized as minerals, an opportunity to visit with our lessee of the year last year, eat more ecosystem services opportunities, and our relationship with CPW on some properties. And we'd be headed up to Northwest Colorado, Craig and Steamboat. I feel like every time we talk about the Craig and Steamboat part of the world, we say we haven't been there in a long time, but it seems like we're there almost every year. So happy to be back in that part of the state. And then, so in terms of the minerals note, we've got a uranium lease out that way, which is kind of an interesting piece of our portfolio. CPW, we might have an opportunity to talk about state wildlife area participation. And so all sorts of good things to look at. August takes us towards the southwest of the state. I'm going to try to get staff to adopt NOMORA as our acronym for North Mountain Ranch. It's sort of like, what we do in big cities when we talk about neighborhoods and towns. We've got the Hesperus Trust down that way. It's been a couple of years already since we've been down that way. There might be an opportunity to speak with or interact with tribal council, tribal representation of Ute Mountain Ute and Southern Ute tribes in that direction. We've got recreation that we'd love to show off, a co-swap project down that way. And so we've got a more detailed outline of stuff that takes us in that direction. And then September, I've abbreviated everything again because I was running out of space, but we've got Chico Basin Ranch we'd be interested in looking at. We could look at or talk more about REPI, and with the questions and the opportunities that come with Sentinel Landscapes, certainly could revive that conversation a little bit. TNC is a big partner in that part of the state with us, so perhaps have conversation with them. Maybe make a trip over or stop over to the San Luis Valley. It's been a bunch of years, I think, since we stopped over at Zapata Falls, and if it's hot still hot in September, it's a nice, refreshing little hike back to the falls and talk about some of the neat natural features that we also have as part of our leasing. So that's the general outline. April, of course, comes faster than we even realize. So we've got staff, getting the logistics locked away, getting us hotel spaces, et cetera. So happy to have any thoughts, any input. If there's any things that you as commissioners would like to see that we haven't in a while, or you want us to try to fit in somewhere, just say so. I put at the bottom of the page, we always want to try to make those stops at best schools. So when we have perhaps a slightly lighter touring agenda on a tour day, maybe we end the day with the best school. Happy to keep that tradition going. And I put CCS, carbon capture and sequestration, as something that we've sort of peppered across the schedule in internal working documents, but I didn't have a specific place to put out there. But there's opportunities to look at, to go out and talk about out on the landscape how CCS fits in. So,
Nick, this on the water side in April, and I get confused on which towns are which, but Northern Water has an amazing campus up there somewhere, and they talk irrigation, this and that, but their management of Trans Mountain Water. Justin would certainly know about it, and maybe that's something to look at, or even have our meeting there if we needed to. It's just
that would be
huge
great.
campus.
That would be great.
It's impressive.
Very.
Somebody's pinging me, but Justin, are you listening along? Do you want
I think we just need to be prepared for early April. It could snow.
I had
I'm just being real about a contingency because that's a snowy time
Yeah,
potentially.
for sure. One of the things we always talk about as staff is, what's the weather what's the snow situation in any of
Yeah.
these places? Because we, on those, especially on north facing properties, we find snow and mud that we can't deal with, and it steers us in a particular direction. So, yeah, good point. But yeah, it was Chris Smith pinging me. We've got Chris lined up to lock in our plans for April and coordinate our plans for April, and he heard that loud and clear. Northern Water would be of interest.
Can I actually ask a question? For a lot of reasons, I think that getting out to Chancellor is really important, given that the RFP process will be happening, and I'm sure we all remember Chico. This might be an opportunity to stop in at Chico and see how the renovations are going, what have you. So my question is, given that May is most likely going to be in Denver and dedicated to interviews, and I have understood that there's not an urgency about it, and July is pretty hot. I'm wondering, is there an opportunity here to maybe do the Chancellor or the Trinidad La Junta in April and move the Fort Collins down to one of these other months?
I'm silent and stalling to waiting for my computer screen to light up with people chatting me, but
Deb, I had the same question. Like if that one feels like a priority, so it might not be a good one to skip. Because I'm guessing we're going to have to drop one of these, given that I think we're going to end up in Denver for 2 days in May.
Yeah.
It
William,
seems like.
William, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you. William Woolston, Field Operations Team Leader. That may be a possibility, and it may actually be a better one. We've adjusted the timing on the Chancellor RFP a little bit, which actually makes the May date. And Abe, you may want to jump in on this as well, but the May date would be very tight with our RFP schedule. If weather permits, April might be better, although it could be tricky down there as well that time of year. But we could certainly look at that. Abe, do you agree with that?
Yeah, Abe Medina, Rec Program Manager. I think we plan to release the RFP early April for a Chancellor, so that I think the timing would work out fine. I think there's still always just a concern with if it rains, those roads down there get really messy really fast. So if there's moisture, but we can.
Yeah,
it may be dry.
You can correct me, but I don't think we used to travel in April just because of the weather question.
I think that's right. This is a pretty aggressive schedule. It's 6 months worth of tours, and having helped with the logistics all those months, 5 is certainly more desirable.
Yeah, I'm just going to be honest. I think we have to keep a lot of flexibility with the director search is our priority, and it is a lot of travel. I'm pretty flexible with my work schedule, but it 6 months of feels a lot to me as well.
So, excuse me, William, I see your hand. Forgive me.
No, sorry, Commissioner Heath. I don't have anything further. Thank you.
So while we're talking schedule, can I just clarify again about March? Are we in March meeting only on Thursday, or are we meeting both days?
As of right now, March is planned for only Thursday the 13th.
So not our regular meeting day.
Correct. One of the two that we generally hold for each month, but yeah, Thursday the 13th. And I've had a request to do what we can to have our agenda complete by noon. that day, so it would be a morning meeting. And depending on agenda, I'm happy to have input as well, but if we find that the agenda is particularly short, again, there's no stress on the staff's part to do it virtually. If it's a short agenda, but if the board wants to gather face to face, we're happy to support that as well.
Great. So I think what we're hearing here is, and I definitely agree that May we need to, we know that at least one day will be taken up with interviews, and there's some uncertainty with that. So, and April weather, who knows? There's the Springs Pueblo stuff that might work, but maybe what we ought to generally get agreement on is, it feels like Chancellor's a priority. And I don't know in any of this, I personally, as a commissioner, have not gone down to Hesperus and the Durango area to see our holdings, and maybe there's an opportunity to drive by the Wilson Mesa or something on the way. I don't know. So anyway, and individually, my two priorities are to get to Trinidad and to get to Durango, and I'd solicit the same kind of priority out of the other commissioners, and then leave it to you all to rock and roll with weather, timing, temperatures to and willing landowners to figure the rest of it out.
I support that, Deb. I'm fine with that. If we go to Durango, get the state plane.
Well, that's a good idea.
It's a fabulous idea, and that's what we've done the last couple trips down there.
I will wave to you from the highway. I am not getting on that plane.
Okay, that's fine.
So yep, input taken. Let me rally the troops on the staff side and provide updates to the commissioners as soon as we've got that. But any other thoughts, desires, questions about what we've sort of generally laid out?
Oh, you could add too, even though it's not a priority necessarily, I agree with Commissioner Heath and Chavez that doing something around Northern Water and the ecosystems and Glade Reservoir would all be really, that would be of strong interest as well.
Yeah. I have to say, I do feel like we go to Craig a lot.
Yeah.
I love it up there. It's easy for me from Summit County. But
we have to be sure we're up there before 6 so that we can get dinner.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
And same with Fort Morgan.
Yeah.
Feels like we were just there too.
Good. Thank you for all that. We've moved enough stuff around that I don't have a nice summary to show you what we've talked about, but I'll send out a note. I'll send out a note and we'll get back.
And when is our dune buggy tour? I've forgotten which date we got for
yeah,
that.
exactly.
Well, San Luis Valley. Let's go. Let's go hit the sand. Okay. And if any other thoughts or ideas, issues come up, feel free to shoot me a note and I'll get staff rallied to support that as well. So we're clear on March for sure. April, we're going to look to potentially move some stuff around, and and then May looks like it might be committed to director work. So that's just a summary there.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you for you and the staff to pulling all these ideas together. It's always easier to react to them than it is to come up with them. So appreciate that.
And by the way, I'm fine if it's virtual. If it's under, 4 hours even,
yeah,
I mean, it probably should be. It's a lot of travel for Philip and even Josie to get from Boulder and rush hours. So
yeah,
I'm all right with virtual too.
Yeah.
Hear you loud and clear.
Yeah, I'll
Thank you
second.
thank you for the support on that.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Great. Good to see everyone.
Oh, do we want to
Yes.
officially take us out, Commissioner?
Maybe one last thing I'll add again further to Commissioner Scanlon's question is, although I have not seen a published version of it, generally speaking, the posting will close on March 24th. At that time, Wendy and the DNR staff will review all resumes to see if they meet the minimum qualifications. The resumes then will be forwarded in packets individually to all the commissioners, along with a rating type of sheet. So commissioners will be reviewing all the resumes, making their notes and prioritizing their top up to, doesn't have to be, but up to 6 candidates, and forwarding that to Wendy with, I encourage you to write as many informing comments about your selections and their attributes, and forward that to Wendy. And at that point, then Commissioner Gibbs and I will review the commissioner selections, comments, and we will work together to identify the final slate of candidates for a panel interview by the commissioners and Dan Gibbs and I believe Wendy. And that will be the only interview activity, will be that set of interviews. And then up to 3 candidates may be forwarded to the governor for a final interview and his consent.
So Deborah, when might we expect getting those resumes to review?
Josie, that is a good question. That's one of the reasons why the interviews were moved to May, to allow time to get through that process after March 24th. It was too tight with the April meeting. So I can't answer that. I can get an idea from Wendy and I would be happy to forward it because I know you have some travel.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I forgot my own question, Deb. So thank you for bringing us back to that process.
You're welcome. All right. So, and I guess it sort of goes without saying, but not really. We need to say it. And that is, I beseech all of us here on the screen and within the organization and on the commission to actively use our networks to forward both the executive director position and also to make others aware that there may be opportunities to serve as a commissioner starting in June. So we love to have just a backlog of qualified individuals with an interest in the mission as candidates for commissioner. And then also, of course, with a timeline of March 24th, we need to get drum up some activity for candidates to submit for that director position.
And I think we got a link to the job description, right?
I think so. And Dan Gibbs, didn't he forward the email?
Yeah, I believe he included you on his email. We'll make 100% sure here this morning that you'll see it again.
I can put it on LinkedIn and such as well.
Yeah,
that would be good.
I can too. Yes. And also just to make a note again, relative to the commissioner potential opportunities, I am going to be reapplying for whatever it is, renewal for another 4-year term. So whether you like it or not, keep it yourself. But the fact is, I want to be on the record that I am going to be reapplying for the commission of the Colorado State Land Board.
Right.
I would hope you would.
Yes.
Thank you.
I'll make your yard signs. Deb.
Thank you, Commissioner.
So let me ask you, you mentioned is Aaron planning to be done in June?
Aaron is not at this time planning to reapply.
Okay.
Yes. All right. Well, that might make it a wrap. Nick?
Okay. If there are no other business items, I think we can adjourn.
We should say before we finish, Nick, how much we appreciate your holding down the fort, doing
Absolutely.
various things. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. I'm doing really good at it.
Thank you.
Yes, enjoy working with you.
Yeah,
All right,
thanks.
thanks everybody.
All right, thank you.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Thanks all.